Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, young adult librarian extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
And I'm Michaela, human being here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
And we're here to talk about, and one of my favorite books.
One of my favorites, too.
It's the Scarlet Pimpernel time.
Yes. Well, I've been nagging about this one.
I know. You definitely want to do it. We're
yes.
going to do 2 weeks of this. We're going to devote 2 weeks to the Scarlet Pimpernel because the subject is that big.
I know. We were on break and you pulled me back in with Scarlet Pimpernel.
Yeah. It's quite a book. He's not as popular now as he used to be.
No, but yeah, I say Scarlet Pimpernel to people, and first of all, they think I'm talking about a bird.
Yeah.
Which, not even close. It's not recognizable.
Yeah.
It's one of those that I don't think held up as well as other books that came out in this time period for sure. But oh my gosh, what amazing characters in it. The plot lines are insane, and it's so good. It's the world's first superhero.
He's the world's first superhero. The Scarlet Pimpernel was the beginning of the effete rich person who pretends to be a worthless playboy who secretly dons a mask and fights crime or does whatever.
No idea who you're alluding to.
When Johnson McCulley wrote Zorro for the pulps, he lifted Scarlet Pimpernel almost entirely and changed the setting to old California. And then when Bob Kane was creating Batman, he lifted the concept again to create Bruce Wayne. Yep. And then that just opened up the floodgate. And after that, there were hundreds of superheroes, more or less exactly like that. But it all started with the Scarlet Pimpernel.
With a strong sense of justice and a great talent for disguise.
Talent for disguise is such a popular skill. Every single pulp hero in the 30s could disguise himself as almost anyone.
But he did it first.
He did it first.
And he's dramatic about it, and I love it.
He's very dramatic about it. Scarlet Pimpernel was created by Baroness Amuska Orsi.
Yes. She was a Hungarian.
A Hungarian baroness.
Yes. And she was actually... This Scarlet Pimpernel takes place during the French Revolution, the big one where they beheaded the king. That's important to know because there have been many French revolutions.
Yes, not the one in Les Mis. They don't really accomplish very much and all get shot.
Yeah, no.
This is the one where they actually take over the country and kill the king and Marie
Peasants'
Antoinette.
Rebellion.
Yeah, Peasants' Rebellion.
And he is the hero that rises to save the lives of the more innocent upper class individuals.
Yeah, Baroness Orsi wasn't that obsessed with historical details or continuity.
Not at all. It's not even a little bit historically accurate, but it's very interesting, a very interesting take. And she was somebody, her grandfather, of course, she has a title, she's a baroness.
She's a baroness,
Her family was very closely tied to the Hungarian royal line. Not related, but high enough station that when there was a peasants' rebellion, very early in her life when she was a young child, her parents decided to move because they kind of saw the writing on the wall. Yeah,
they fled Hungary, to avoid an angry mob of peasants.
And this is kind of and she had said that this is the hero that she had fantasized existed for her when she was young like that to kind of save her family and would have been able to stay in their home and stay safe. But she puts him in the setting of revolutionary France, which of course works beautifully.
It's such a perfect setting for an adventure story because France in that time was incredibly chaotic, incredibly violent. Anybody could be arrested for any reason, and if you're arrested, you're almost automatically guillotined.
Yeah.
There was just no other way about it.
It was the only way to they had these peasants rising up, and like any new regime, any new form of government, they took it completely to the extremes. There was no moderation. And basically you have all these starving, bloodthirsty people, even though there's no longer a king on the throne, a lot of the problems that were intrinsic with being a peasant in revolutionary France, like starving.
The poverty and starvation didn't change under the revolution.
It didn't change.
It only got worse.
But if you guillotine a bunch of nobility, these people that you have set up like the oppressors, then you kind of quell those starving masses. They're happy, they feel like change is happening, even though it really isn't from an upper standpoint.
Yeah, so it's not surprising that the Baroness takes the point of view of the aristocrats rather than the peasants. The mobs of Paris, in her view, are an incredibly filthy and bloodthirsty and psychotic mob.
Yeah.
The
peasants of Paris form one character altogether.
Yeah.
They are
altogether.
It's the mob mentality. The mob mentality is a character unto itself.
Yeah, she has no sympathy for the revolutionaries. Now, when I first studied the French Revolution history class, I learned that the people of France rose up because of the incredible abuses heaped on them by the titled aristocracy, who would abuse them for generation after generation. But in Scarlet Pimpernel, I find out it turns out the entire aristocracy were all pure, innocent nobility, the cream of Europe, completely without flaw or blemish in any way. And it's the mob that attacked them who were the bad guys.
It's wild that I love this book, even though it's about saving the 1%.
Saving the 1% should be the subtitle of the book. Yeah. Critics have pointed out she tries to kind of soften that by pointing out that the Pimpernel mostly rescues like families with little kids and
small
things like that.
Small children that would have been
He's very
executed.
good at rescuing small children. Yeah. So that, and she does grudgingly admit that occasionally aristocrats might have gone too far. The one that beat up Armand.
Oh my God! Yeah,
he kind of deserved it, but at the same time, we'll get to that in a minute. So yeah, for the most part, the aristocracy is always completely pure and noble, and they don't deserve their horrible fate at the hands of the mob. And indeed, it's looking back on it historically, it was such a horrific time. They killing hundreds of people a day with the guillotine.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It was blood sport. Like, they literally had quotas that they had.
It wasn't an exaggeration that the streets were ankle deep with blood.
Yeah.
In fact, the committee was upset they weren't killing nobles fast enough. The guillotine was too slow.
Yeah.
And so at one point they hit on the idea of putting them all on a barge with a hole in it and tying their wrists and ankles so they all sink and drown like rats while everybody cheers on the banks of the Seine.
Entertainment for the whole family.
Absolutely, yeah. So Baroness Orczy was able to make her way as a writer. Mm-hmm. She not only created the Scarlet Pimpernel, she also created two other characters who definitely made their mark on mystery fiction. She created Lady Molly of Scotland Yard, the very first female detective. Yep. And she also invented the old man in the corner, who was the very first armchair detective who solved crimes by not doing a thing but sitting there and talking to people.
I mean, it was the 40s,
Yeah.
30s and 40s. I mean, you had to write some detective fiction.
Yeah. And also, one thing I learned while researching this was that it was a play before it was a book.
It was a play before it was a
successful play, which is why part of it is kind of stagey a little bit.
Yeah, it does feel like there are definite scenes within it. They wrote, her and her husband wrote a play version of it while she was working on the book, and the play version got picked up before the book got published. And there are major differences in the play versus the book itself.
I've not seen the original play.
The original play, like for instance, our main character here, at least the character from whom the main point of view is Marguerite Saint-Just, now Margarite Blakeney.
Yes.
She is married a fancy English baronet. Mm-hmm. She is a French woman, and she is within French society, but not necessarily a high enough noble that she ever has to worry about being guillotined.
Well, she was a star of the stage.
In the play version, she's a star of the stage. Which is, of course, a little bit dangerous to be.
It was mentioned that, British aristocrats often take their mistresses from the stage, but not their wives.
Mm-hmm. Well, Percy.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about her husband.
Yes.
Percy Blakeney. He is described as a big, tall, kind of a bumbling oaf. He is a fop. He is within the fabrics trade and very into his well-tailored clothes.
He loves clothing.
He is a peacock and a half. He is what you think of when you think British fop, powdered wig, fancy cane.
Absolutely. He has a very affected manner of speaking.
Yes.
Says, sink me way too frequently.
Yes, sink me.
He's the kind of person who interrupts a scene where someone is about to murder someone by walking into the room and saying, "Have you noticed my new tie for my cravat?"
Yes.
And begins tying and untying his cravat for the guy with the gun. That's Sir Percy in action. Baroness Orczy describes him in the first book as 6 foot of gorgeousness.
Yeah, 6 foot of gorgeousness.
So he's incredibly handsome. And Marguerite is indescribably beautiful.
Yeah, she is one of the most beautiful women in all of Europe, and she is the cleverest woman.
The cleverest woman in Europe. But they say several times, reading the book, I wish she had been more clever. I wanted her to be Percy's equal, and somehow, for all of her believing in strong female characters, Baroness Orczy never really brings Marguerite up to Blakeney's level.
Well, Marguerite is clever, and she's called clever in those social circles. And I think for those social circles that she is in, she is very, very clever.
Yeah.
But when you give any sort of real-world application to it, she doesn't have, in the book anyway, she doesn't really have street smarts.
Yeah.
she is very self-absorbed. The reason that she agrees to marry Percy is because he is so infatuated with her, and she even says that, wouldn't it be nice to have a love slave husband?
Exactly. Indeed, he is her love slave. She's incredibly clever, and he acts incredibly stupid. Although she also sees things in him other people don't. The natural assumption is she wanted a title and she wanted to get out of France and become rich. So it's assumed that it's that kind of marriage by almost everyone. But Margarite is so charming and so delightful that no one's really bothered too much by that she's basically a gold digger in everybody's eyes. So they make an interesting couple. In the book, Sir Percy is not the main character. Margarite is really the main character. Yeah. We never see anything from Sir Percy's point of view. And that's partly because the baroness was working on the mystery of who the Pimpernel really was. The book doesn't reveal it till way late.
All of the tropes, though, within this book, like the hero in disguise, because we have things like Batman, Superman, and all of these, different superheroes, you can see what she's trying to do in the book, but reading it as a modern reader, it is very obvious who the Pimpernel is.
We could never have the same experience the audience did in the beginning. The people who were really baffled by that. It's like trying to read Jekyll and Hyde today and not notice, Blakeney is a great character. They're both great characters in their own right.
Yeah.
And their arch enemy, the bad guy who'll come back in several sequels, is Shavulin.
Yes, Citoyen Shavulin.
Citoyen Shavulin. He's a fantastic villain.
He's so good. He's everything Javert should have been.
Well, he seems to model after Javert a lot. And also, Sir Percy constantly dresses in flamboyant, brightly colored outfits, and Shavulin always wears black. He dresses in sable.
Like he's going to a funeral.
Yeah, always. We'll
talk about the film adaptation, but Gandalf himself.
Percy is tall and strong, and Shavulin is short and kind of sallow skin.
He kind of reminds me of... is it Mr. Collins from Pride and Prejudice? Like this just sort of small, persnickety, slimy
He has a fox-like face, and he's extremely clever. He's not clever in the same way that Margarite or Sir Percy is, though. In the first book, there's a scene where he fantasizes about having this Pimpernel at his mercy and how he will beg and cower, for his freedom. But of course, we the readers already know that's never going to happen. Even if he is caught, Percy would never grovel like that. But Shavulin still can't quite grasp what he's dealing with when he's fighting the Pimpernel. It takes him, several books before he actually figures it out. One fact that I learned that I thought was absolutely fascinating, although everything in the book is fictitious and her facts, even the things that really happened, she doesn't give the right date for them. But Shavulin was a real person.
Was he really?
There was a Shavulin, and he was an envoy from the Revolutionary Committee to England.
Yeah.
He had an amazing career. He wasn't a diplomat because he wasn't an ambassador, because to make an ambassador, you have to recognize the country that sends you, and England wouldn't recognize that revolutionary France existed. So he came as an envoy with papers, and first he arrived, and they decided his papers weren't good enough and sent him back to France. So he arrived with more papers later, and this time they grudgingly accepted him in. However, a week after he got there, they beheaded King Louis. And so, needless to say, his attempt to have a private, conference with King George did not go very well. So once again, he left England, but he kept coming back. And at one point, he was actually jailed by the revolutionaries, facing the guillotine. Somehow he escaped. Listen to this career. He escaped from the guillotine, and then later worked for Napoleon as a diplomat, possibly a spy. And he was so successful working for Napoleon, he was kept on when the Bourbon Restoration took over after Waterloo.
You're too good at your job. You might be a
He is so good at his job. The Shavulin of the book might not be as clever as the real Shavulin, but one thing about the Shavulin in the book, he discovers who the Scarlet Pimpernel is, like halfway through the book, but he never tells anyone. Only he knows the Pimpernel's secret, because that's the ultimate job security. Because if they kill him, they'll have to start from scratch tracking down the Pimpernel.
Yeah. Well, also, he is determined. He is the one who's going to
Of course, he is the only one who can outwit the Pimpernel.
Bring in the Pimpernel.
Yeah.
But yes, so Percy, of course, is actually the Pimpernel.
Yeah.
Incredibly intelligent. Hyper intelligent, is actually running a group. Of people that are working with him. He's because he is in the fabric trade, he has a boat, the Daydream.
The Daydream, yes.
So he's constantly sailing back and forth between France and England, and no one is the wiser. He plays this dumb fop character so perfectly that even if he went up to somebody and said, "I am the Scarlet Pimpernel," they would laugh in his face.
Yes, and they make a thing of that in several of the movie versions. It doesn't happen in the first book. He's just an amazing character. I love his complete nonchalance about everything. At one point when he runs into Shavulin, who has disguised himself as a priest, and who is obviously there to kill him.
Yeah.
Instead of leaving, Blakeney strides over to the table and says, "Well, sink me, Shavulin. I didn't know you'd taken orders." And and immediately plops himself down and starts this robust conversation with him, while Shavulin just glaring at him.
He's such a brat.
He's terrible.
I love it. I love it so much.
So basically, the structure of the book it's been described as a quasi swashbuckler historical adventure and a romance, and there's elements of all of that in there. There's no sword fights in the first book.
There is no sword fights in the first book, although they do talk about what an accomplished sword master
he is. He's a great pugilist and a sword master, but there's no fights in the first book, because when I read these as a kid, I noticed that the Pimpernel is basically a pacifist.
He really is. He prefers to outwit his opponents.
Yeah.
Just to give a little more background on the plot, just so my favorite Pimpernel outwit in this first book makes sense.
Yep.
So Margarite is married Percy, and she is completely oblivious of the fact that he is the Scarlet Pimpernel. At their wedding, or very soon after their wedding, her brother Armand had been beaten savagely by a nobleman whose name is escaping me.
I forget.
I know, right? I just had it. But
I think it's Saint Cyr.
Saint Cyr, yes. Yeah. Beaten by Saint Cyr because Armand, charming like his sister, was fooling around with Saint Cyr's daughter. Yeah. So Marguerite wants to get revenge, so she lets some information slide about Saint Cyr, just trying to get him in trouble, not get him executed. However, this information leads them to show that he has connections with some rebellious folk that gets Saint Cyr and his entire family thrown in the prison and completely beheaded. Yeah. Percy finds this out, not completely knowing all of the details, and he thinks that she is a hardcore French revolutionary. He's in a position now where he can't divorce her, he can't do anything like that. He is stuck married to her, and therefore can never tell her his secret that he's the Scarlet Pimpernel, and their marriage becomes very cold and broken.
Yeah. He keeps the mask on and never reveals himself to her.
Marguerite feels sick about learning the fact that she let a little piece of information slide, and it wound up causing this whole family to die. She's actually a very good, noble character considering the situation that she's in. And she winds up, she wants to help the Pimpernel. She actually all of the women, I feel like in England, are in love with the Pimpernel. They're just like, oh, if only the Pimpernel were my husband. So she's looking at her husband, this big dumb oaf, fantasizing that he's the Pimpernel. Little does she know. She finally does confide in him after long stretches of time have passed on. Her brother Armand now is potentially going to be thrown into jail back in France, and she doesn't know what to do. So she does go to her husband. She does let her guard down. She is vulnerable, and she explains to him the situation and that her brother is in peril, and she doesn't know what to do. So he sails off for France to try to fix it for his wifey. Yeah. When he leaves, she realizes he's the Scarlet Pimpernel.
Too late. She realizes to save the life of her brother, she's costing the life of her husband.
And she immediately also sails to France, and they do meet up in this very disgusting hovel area. And of course, Shavulin is not far behind.
Yes.
And he, at this point, also knows that Percy is the Scarlet Pimpernel.
Yeah.
So Percy, of course, tells her to hide upstairs. He's got this. He'll handle it. And Shavulin, of course, cocky as ever, thinks he's got him. Percy offers him some snuff tobacco. This is my favorite one. He replaces it with pure black pepper, which is the stupidest thing ever. But I love it so much because he literally escapes because Shavulin cannot stop sneezing and crying.
Yeah.
He literally escapes because he gave him pepper to snort, and he took it. I'm sorry.
He was so distraught over this ridiculous conversation that Percy kept talking to him when he wanted to slip out and get his troops, and Percy wouldn't leave him alone.
Yeah. Yep. There's lots of little things like that in the book.
One of my favorite scenes is when Marguerite opens up to him about her brother being in danger. He promises that her brother won't die, but still doesn't say what he's feeling, still doesn't say who he is. And they have one of those weird, stiff, cold conversations. And then when she finally turns and goes back into the house, he throws himself to the ground and kisses where her foot touched the ground.
Yes.
He literally kisses the ground she walks on because he can't express how he really feels about her to her face. That is like so sad.
He adores her, and when he does find out that, she isn't this nefarious creature.
Yeah.
He nearly breaks because he really hasn't been treating her the way he wants to be treating her, because he does. He loves her desperately. This is such a, if it ended badly, it would be the most tragic romance.
Yeah. Oh, God, yeah. You know what this reminded me of so much?
What?
Pride and Prejudice.
It does remind me of Pride and Prejudice. The characters remind me of the characters in Pride and Prejudice.
It's not a ripoff of Pride and Prejudice by any stretch of the imagination, but the fact they are two people who love each other deeply, who are driven apart by their pride and their prejudice.
Yeah.
Yeah, they both have to overcome their flaws before they can see the other person for who they really are.
Yeah, no, and it does feel like, even though it's a completely outlandish situation, because of these little things, like even the fact when he's cold to her, like she really internalizes all of that. It feels like a real relationship.
Yeah.
It feels like a real marriage.
Yeah, it does.
And, that's what's really cool about them working together as a couple. When they work together, they're unstoppable. But when they're apart like that, it just really, it's not great. Yeah. So when Percy is in France and he's there to save Armand, and of course Marguerite comes along, and you've got Shavulin, you've got all these things happening in the mix, we need to talk about part of the book that did not age well.
Yeah. I think Baroness Orczy didn't have a very sensitive ear to a lot of issues.
I think she was somebody of very limited experience dealing with anyone who was of a lower social class. I mean, the way she writes about the French peasantry in this book is indicative of that. The way she talks,
the peasants are all hideous and
filthy and stinky and mean. But there is this one character in the book. It's literally, there's a chapter called The Jew.
The Jew, yeah.
The Jew. Percy has run away. He's just given Shavulin pepper to snort, and he has run away. And of course, Shavulin is scrambling with his troops.
Yep.
And an old Jewish man has come into town, and Shavulin says, well, did you see this person going? Oh, yes, I sold him my old horse. It's a very terrible stereotype of a Jewish person. With all of the negative stereotypes that go along with it. This man is portraying, he's portrayed as very greedy, dirty, he complains. It's all of these negative Jewish stereotypes that are in this book, which is very hard to read.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you shouldn't confuse the author with the character. It's Shavulin who says all these things.
It's Shavulin's perspective on this character. So the character is anti-Semitic. The writer is writing an anti-Semitic character. It's not necessarily the author.
But she does lay it on really thick.
She lays it on really thick, and it is really hard, to read. And that's really, as far as these books go, the view of peasants and the views of really any other, minority group, it is very generalized, and it's very stereotypical, and these really not great stereotypes of really anyone who is poor within these books.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah.
But the rest of it's really good. But that part it's really not great. And just a warning, if you are going to read it, know that that's in there. It is towards the end.
You still can't skip that chapter. Because
you can't skip that chapter. It's a very important chapter. And Chauvelin's such a villain. He beats this man within an inch of his life. Yeah. That's a hard bit to read. That is a very hard bit to read.
Yeah. One of the things critics were saying about it was that at the time the book was written, the British Empire was starting to unravel a little bit.
Yeah.
And for good or ill, Sir Percy became a stereotype of a British person. He is the most British of all British characters.
He's violently British.
Yes, he's violently British. And in a lot of ways, he's how British people, at least the upper class, like to see themselves.
Yeah.
No matter how I look, I still, have what it takes when the chips are down and that kind of thing. The stiff upper lip and that sort of thing. Yeah. So he became very stereotypical.
The book is full of stereotypes. I mean, it really is. It's just, but that was the period it was written in by a character who...
1905,
by a writer who, you know, definitely didn't know many poor people. Definitely
didn't get out a lot.
Didn't get out a lot. She mostly hung out with the upper crusts of society and the theater crowd.
Yeah.
And that was pretty much it. So it is written through a lens of somebody who had limited life experience and interaction with, you know, people who weren't necessarily part of her social class. But still, it was an amazingly creative premise.
It was her $1 million idea. She lived off that for the rest of her life.
I'm excited next week when we get to delve into the musical.
Next week we're talking about the sequels, the movies, the Broadway musical.
I love the movie with Jane Seymour. It's phenomenal, and I recommend, you know, especially if you don't want to go 12 books deep, 14 books deep. We're still not sure because there are different lists everywhere.
Every list you find online lists a different number of books. She wrote a lot of books. She wrote about Sir Percy's descendants and then his ancestors and one thing that I noticed reading about this, talking about the movie versions, Leslie Howard did a famous movie version, which is in public domain, so it's like all over YouTube. It's a very good one. However, when World War II rolled around, he wanted to do something for the war effort, so he actually produced and directed a updating of the Pimpernel to modern times in the 1940s called Pimpernel Smith, about someone helping people escape the Nazis. And this happened to be the movie that was seen by Raoul Wallenberg, which convinced him to help Jews flee the Nazis.
That's awesome.
That was the movie, Wallenberg said, that was the movie that changed my life and set his course. So he saved about 15,000 Jewish people who were on the run. So you can literally say that Baroness Orczy's creation saved the lives of thousands of people.
Well, it's just, you know, that's the thing. Percy is somebody who is comfortable. He is wealthy. He has a title. He has everything. His country is stable. Another place was not.
Yeah, England was not at war with France.
No.
You know.
But he saw an injustice in the world, and he corrected it.
Yeah.
He did everything he could, not through violence, but through using his wits. And I think that's something that we can appreciate
Absolutely.
today.
Yeah.
I mean,
we need a lot more Pimpernels.
He's Batman's great-great-great-great-grandfather.
Absolutely. Any closing thoughts?
Just the most wonderful. So Percy writes a poem about the Scarlet Pimpernel that he performs at a party, and it is so funny. They seek him here, they seek him there. Those Frenchies seek him everywhere. Is he in heaven? Is he in hell? That damned, elusive Pimpernel. I just love it. It's so good. That's my ending thought.
Yes, I love the fact that it's a drama of manners rather than a comedy of manners. Like at one point, Marguerite steals a note that the Pimpernel is trying to pass to one of his lieutenants, and the lieutenant sees her with the note and tries to take it from her, but he can't be impolite or rude to Lady Blakeney, of course. So even though he knows people will die if he doesn't recover that note, he still is incredibly polite and solicitous to her and never gets the note back, actually.
Never get. I guess you have that now. I guess that's yours.
Yeah. He just gives up rather than saying something mean to Lady Blakeney. Or,
she might cry.
Yeah.
It would be terrible.
Yeah, sure, it's a life or death struggle, but don't forget their manners. Manners are very important.
They're British.
They're British, of course. They're all very, very British in this book.
But yes, and next week we will discuss more. Next week
we'll go even deeper into the world of the Scarlet Pimpernel. All right, so until then, I have been Ed.
I have been Michaela.
We'll see you next time. Until then, be safe.
Be happy, be healthy. Bye.
Bye.